It's honestly pathetic that you're still just a waitress at 28, Maya. My mother's voice cut through the dinner conversation like a knife through silk, and I felt every person at the table turn to look at me, their expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed agreement. I sat there at my parents' dining room table, fork halfway to my mouth, the pasta I'd been eating suddenly tasteless as cardboard, and I couldn't even bring myself to look up because I knew exactly what I'd see in their faces. My sister Jessica sat across from me, and though she had the decency to look down at her plate, I could see the smallest smile playing at the corner of her lips, that same smile she'd worn since we were children whenever Mom and Dad praised her and ignored me. I mean, Jessica has built an entire business at 25, my mother continued, warming to her theme now, gesturing with her wine glass toward my sister, who glanced up with practiced modesty. She has her own boutique downtown, she's an entrepreneur, she's making something of herself. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, with everything she didn't need to say about what I was or wasn't making of myself. My father nodded along, cutting his steak with careful precision, and added, "It's not too late for you to ask Jessica for a job, Maya. I'm sure she could use someone to help at the boutique, and it would be more respectable than serving tables." I felt my Aunt Linda shift uncomfortably beside me, but she said nothing, and neither did my Uncle Tom or my grandparents at the far end of the table, and their silence felt like complicity, like agreement, like confirmation that yes, I was exactly as pathetic as my mother claimed. I was 28 years old, and I had been working at Marchand's, one of the most upscale restaurants in Seattle, for 4 years. And before that, I'd worked at 3 other restaurants, building my way up from hostess to server, to senior server, to someone the management actually consulted on operations. But none of that mattered here, in this dining room, where the only success that counted was the kind that came with a title and a storefront, and parents willing to fund your dreams. "I'm doing fine, Mom," I managed to say, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be, and I hated how small I sounded, how defensive. "Fine isn't good enough," she replied, and she wasn't even looking at me anymore. She was looking at Jessica with such pride, such naked favoritism, that it made my chest ache. Jessica is thriving, she has ambition, she has vision. What she didn't say, what she never said, but what hung in the air nonetheless, was that I had neither of those things, that I was drifting, directionless, a disappointment, in a black server's apron, bringing other people their food, while my younger sister built an empire. Jessica finally spoke up, her voice sugary sweet with false concern. "Maya, I really could use help, you know. The boutique is expanding, and I need people I can trust. Family." She reached across the table like she was offering me salvation, like she was doing me a favor. And I looked at her hand with her perfectly manicured nails and her delicate silver rings that our parents had bought her for her last birthday, while I'd received a card with $50 in it. I didn't take her hand. I picked up my water glass instead and took a long drink, buying myself time, trying to swallow down the humiliation that was rising in my throat like bile. This wasn't new. This was the pattern of my entire adult life. Every family dinner, every holiday gathering, every phone call where my mother asked what I was doing with myself, in that tone that suggested she already knew the answer and found it wanting. But something about tonight felt different, felt like a culmination. Like all those years of casual cruelty had been building to this moment where she called me pathetic in front of everyone I was supposed to love and who were supposed to love me. I set down my water glass and looked at my mother directly for the first time since she'd spoken. "I'm not pathetic," I said, and my voice was steadier now. She waved her hand dismissively. "Of course not, dear. I just think you could be doing so much more with your life." The money conversation had happened 3 years ago, almost to the day, and I could still remember every detail of it like it had been burned into my memory with a brand. I had been 25, Jessica had been 22, and fresh out of college with a marketing degree she'd barely used, and I had been working at restaurants for 7 years by then, saving every penny I could, dreaming of culinary school. I had found a program, a good one, the Seattle Culinary Institute, and it cost $5,000 for their professional development certificate in restaurant management, and I had saved $3,000 of it already, and I just needed help with the rest. Just a loan, I'd told my parents. I would pay them back within a year. I had sat in their living room with the brochure in my hands, my carefully prepared speech about career advancement and professional growth and return on investment, and my father had barely looked up from his newspaper. "Maya, you're doing fine as you are," he'd said, the same dismissive tone I'd heard my whole life. "We don't see the point in spending money on something when you already have a job." My mother had been more direct. $5,000 is a lot of money to spend on a hobby, sweetheart. If you want to learn cooking, there are YouTube videos. I had tried to explain that it wasn't about cooking, it was about management, about understanding the business side of restaurants, about moving up from server to supervisor to manager, about building a real career in hospitality. But they weren't listening. They had already decided. And I had left that living room with my brochure and my dreams and my $3,000. That wasn't enough. 6 months later, Jessica had announced at Sunday dinner that she wanted to open a boutique. She had an idea, she'd said, for a clothing store that would focus on sustainable fashion and local designers, and she had found the perfect location downtown, and she just needed startup capital. And I had watched as my parents leaned forward with interest, asking questions, taking notes, treating her dream like it was legitimate and viable and worthy of investment. Within 2 weeks, they had given her $78,000. I knew the exact number because Jessica had told me herself, gushing about it over coffee, completely oblivious to how the information landed like a punch to my stomach. $78,000 for a business plan she'd written on a napkin versus $0 for my carefully researched educational program. The boutique had opened 4 months later with a party I'd been expected to attend, where I'd smiled and congratulated my sister and pretended that I didn't feel like I was dying inside, and our parents had been so proud, taking photos, posting on Facebook about their entrepreneur daughter, while I went back to my studio apartment in the less fashionable part of Capitol Hill and looked at my rejection and tried to figure out what I'd done wrong. But the money wasn't the only inequality, it was just the most obvious one. My parents had also co-signed the lease on Jessica's downtown loft, a 2-bedroom place with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that cost $2,800 a month, and they paid half her rent, $1,400 every single month, because they said she needed to live somewhere nice to maintain her professional image. I lived in a 400-square-foot studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom so small I could barely turn around in it, and I paid $950 a month, every penny of it from my own tips and wages. And when I'd mentioned once that I might look for a bigger place, my mother had said that I should learn to live within my means. I worked double shifts, closing the restaurant at midnight and then coming back to open at 10 the next morning, sleeping 5 hours a night. My feet aching constantly, my back sore from carrying heavy trays, saving every dollar I could because no one was going to help me, no one was going to invest in me, no one was going to co-sign anything or pay half of anything or believe that I deserved more than what I could earn with my own 2 hands. The humiliation hadn't been a single event, but rather a sustained campaign that had stretched across years, each incident building on the last until they formed an architecture of casual cruelty, so normalized that my family didn't even seem to recognize what they were doing anymore. There was my cousin Rachel's wedding 2 years ago, an elegant affair at a vineyard in Woodinville, where my mother had introduced Jessica to distant relatives as my successful daughter who owns her own business. And then, when they'd asked about me standing right there beside her, had said, "Maya is still figuring things out," with a sympathetic smile that made me want to disappear into the manicured grass beneath my feet. There was Thanksgiving 18 months ago when I'd had to work the dinner shift at Marchand's because holiday service was all hands on deck and the tips were too good to pass up, And I'd arrived at my parents' house at 11 p.m. with a pumpkin pie I'd bought from the restaurant's pastry chef, still in my work clothes because I hadn't had time to go home and change. And my father had made a joke about how I'd dressed up as a waitress for Halloween, except it was November, and everyone had laughed. And Jessica had been sitting there in a designer dress our mother had bought her, glowing with wine and praise. There was Christmas that same year, when we'd exchanged gifts, and Jessica had received a professional camera worth $2,000 because she'd mentioned wanting to do her own product photography for the boutique's Instagram. And I had received a gift card to Target for $100 with a note saying, "Treat yourself to something nice." And I had smiled and said thank you, while something inside me cracked a little further. There was my grandmother's 80th birthday party, where my Aunt Susan had asked what I was up to these days, and before I could answer, my mother had jumped in with, "Maya is working at a restaurant, she's very good at customer service," with that particular emphasis that made customer service sound like a euphemism for failure. And then she'd immediately pivoted to talking about how Jessica had just been featured in a local blog's roundup of Seattle boutiques to watch. There was the Sunday brunch 6 months ago when my father had been talking about his retirement planning and had mentioned that he and my mother were hoping to travel more in the next few years. And Jessica had said something about how she'd love to join them in Italy someday, and my father had said, "We'll make it happen, sweetheart." And then he'd looked at me and said, "You should save up your tip money, Maya. Maybe you could come too." And the table had gone quiet for just a moment before my mother had changed the subject. There was Easter 3 months ago when I'd brought a boyfriend, someone I'd been seeing for only a few weeks, but who I'd thought might be something more. And my mother had asked him what he did, and he'd said he was a sous chef, and she'd said, "Oh, so you and Maya met at work. How convenient," in a tone that suggested we were both engaged in some quaint hobby rather than actual careers. And my boyfriend had looked confused, and I'd had to explain later why I'd been so quiet the rest of the afternoon, and we'd broken up 2 weeks after that, not because of my family, but not entirely unrelated to them either. There was every single phone call where my mother asked how I was doing, and then spent 45 minutes talking about Jessica's latest boutique event, or social media milestone, or business challenge. And there was every family group chat where my sister's achievements were celebrated with strings of emoji and exclamation points, while my mention of getting promoted to senior server had received 3 responses: a thumbs up from my dad, a "that's nice" from my mom, and a heart emoji from Jessica that felt more patronizing than supportive. There was the subtle and not so subtle drumbeat of being treated like the family disappointment, the one who hadn't lived up to her potential, the cautionary tale, the daughter they loved but didn't quite respect. And it had worn me down over years until I'd almost started to believe their version of me, almost started to accept that maybe I was pathetic, maybe I was just a waitress, maybe I would always be less than Jessica, no matter what I did. What my family didn't know, what they had never bothered to ask about or notice, was that I had been building something in the spaces between their dismissal and my exhaustion. In the quiet hours after midnight, when I came home from closing shifts and sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop and my notebooks and my dreams that I had learned to keep private. I had been studying restaurant management for 3 years, ever since that rejection from my parents, taking online courses through Cornell's hospitality program that cost me $240 each, courses I paid for with my tip money and completed at 2 in the morning with my feet soaking in Epsom salt and my back aching from 12-hour shifts. I had certifications now, actual credentials that I'd earned in secret: Serve Safe Manager, Tips Alcohol Training, a professional certificate in restaurant operations management. And I was halfway through a hospitality leadership program that would be finished in 4 months. I had a notebook, a leather-bound journal I'd bought for myself as a birthday present 2 years ago, and it was filled with my handwriting, pages and pages of restaurant concepts I'd developed, menu ideas, staffing models, cost projections, marketing strategies, everything I'd learned from working front of house, combined with everything I'd taught myself about the business side of hospitality. I had studied P&L statements until I could read them like novels, had memorized food cost percentages and labor ratios and table turn times, had learned about supplier negotiations and inventory management, and the subtle psychology of menu design and pricing. I had made myself into an expert while my family thought I was just serving pasta and pouring wine. I had networked too, deliberately and strategically, talking to every restaurant owner and general manager and chef who came through Marchand's, asking questions, showing genuine interest, making connections that my family never knew about, because I had learned not to share things that they would only diminish. I had the business card of the regional director of a major restaurant group who had told me to call him when I was ready to move into management. I had the personal email of a James Beard-nominated chef who had been impressed by how I'd handled a difficult situation with a demanding regular. I had recommendations written and saved in a folder on my laptop, glowing references from industry professionals who actually saw what I was capable of. And I had money, my own money, $15,032 in a savings account that my parents didn't know existed. Money I'd accumulated through brutal discipline and sacrifice over the past 3 years. I worked every double shift I could get, picked up every extra serving shift, worked every holiday and every weekend, took the bad sections and the difficult tables that other servers avoided because they tipped better if you handled them right. I hadn't bought new clothes in 2 years, except for work shoes when my old ones wore through. I made my coffee at home, brought my lunch in Tupperware, walked instead of taking the bus when the weather allowed it, negotiated my internet bill down by $40 a month, cut my own hair, bought my groceries at the discount store in bulk. Every dollar I didn't absolutely have to spend went into that account, and I watched it grow with a fierce pride that I couldn't share with anyone, because my family would have found some way to make it seem small, or suggested I loan it to Jessica, or told me I should be saving more. I had dreams, real concrete plans, and the secret knowledge that I was good at this work, genuinely talented at understanding how restaurants functioned and how to make them better. And I had been building towards something that my family couldn't see because they had decided who I was years ago and had never bothered to look closely enough to see that I had become someone else entirely. The first time I noticed something was wrong with Jessica's boutique was about 7 months ago. Though in retrospect the signs had probably been there longer, and I had simply been too absorbed in my own survival and my secret studies to pay attention to the business that my family treated as their collective golden child. I was at my parents' house for Sunday dinner, something I still subjected myself to every few weeks out of some combination of obligation and masochism. And I had gone to the kitchen to refill my water glass when I heard Jessica on the phone in the hallway speaking in a voice I'd never heard her use before, tight and desperate and very young. "I understand that, but if you could just give me 2 more weeks, I promise the payment will clear," she was saying, and there was a pleading quality that made me pause with my hand on the refrigerator door. "I have inventory I can't move. I just need a little more time to liquidate some pieces, and then I can pay the full invoice plus the late fee." I had stayed quiet in the kitchen, not wanting to intrude, but unable to avoid hearing as she continued to negotiate with what was clearly a supplier who was done being patient. And when she finally ended the call, I heard her lean against the wall and let out a shaky breath that sounded close to crying. That same evening, my father had mentioned something about adjusting some investments, his tone casual but his expression worried in a way that made me wonder if there was a connection I wasn't seeing yet. 3 weeks after that, I was at the boutique itself, something I rarely did because being there felt like walking through a monument to my parents' faith in Jessica versus their lack of faith in me. But my mother had asked me to drop off some paperwork, and I had agreed because it was easier than explaining why I didn't want to. The store was beautiful, I had to admit that, with its exposed brick and carefully curated racks of clothing and the aesthetic that Jessica had worked hard to develop. But it was also empty at 3 p.m. on a Saturday, which seemed wrong for a retail business in a high-traffic neighborhood. Jessica was behind the counter looking at her laptop, and I could see from across the room that she was staring at a spreadsheet with a lot of red numbers. And when she noticed me, she'd close the laptop quickly, with an expression that looked like guilt mixed with panic. Slow day? I'd asked, keeping my voice neutral, and she had laughed in a way that sounded brittle and said, slow month, slow year, slow existence, before seeming to catch herself and adding, I'm fine, just some seasonal variation, totally normal. But her smile hadn't reached her eyes, and I had noticed that some of the racks looked sparse, like she was running low on inventory but couldn't afford to reorder. The real confirmation had come 2 months ago when I was at my parents' house using their printer, because mine had died and I hadn't had time to replace it, and I saw a bank statement on my father's desk that showed a withdrawal of $25,000 with a memo line that read, Loan, Jessica Business. I shouldn't have looked, but I did, and I saw other withdrawals too, 12,000 in November, 15,000 in January, 8,000 in March. And I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I understood that my parents were pouring money into a business that was clearly drowning. I heard them talking about it a week later when I came by to return a dish my mother had sent me home with, their voices carrying from the kitchen where they thought they were alone. We can't keep doing this, my father was saying. We've already pulled 65,000 from our retirement accounts, and if the boutique doesn't start turning a profit soon, we're going to have a serious problem. My mother's response was defensive and firm. She just needs more time. She's building something, and we're not going to abandon our daughter when she needs us. And I had stood frozen in the hallway, understanding that they had now invested over $140,000 in Jessica's dream, while I had built my expertise and my savings entirely alone. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon in early April, 3 weeks after I'd overheard my parents talking about their retirement accounts, and 2 days after a particularly brutal Sunday dinner where my mother had sighed heavily and said that some people were born with ambition and others just coasted through life, her eyes on me as she said it. I was in the office at Marchand's going over the reservation book and making notes about a large party we had coming in that weekend, doing the kind of detail work that I had gradually taken on over the past year, as the general manager had come to trust my organizational skills and my understanding of how to orchestrate a smooth service. Chef Marcus knocked on the doorframe, and when I looked up, he had an expression I couldn't quite read, something between excited and nervous, and he asked if I had a few minutes to talk about something important. My immediate thought was that I was being let go, that somehow they had discovered I was overqualified or overstepping, or that my ambition was showing too clearly. But instead, he came in and closed the door and said, I'm opening a new restaurant, a place I've been planning for 3 years, and I want you to be my general manager. I remember staring at him, the words not quite processing, and he continued talking, explaining that he'd been watching me for the past 18 months, had seen how I handled difficult situations and managed staff dynamics, and understood the flow of service in a way that most people with twice my experience never grasped. He said he'd seen my certifications when I'd submitted an updated resume 6 months ago for our files, had noticed that I was taking advanced courses, had realized that I was building towards something bigger than my current position. He told me about the new restaurant, a modern American concept in the Pearl District with 120 seats and an open kitchen and a bar program that would be destination-worthy, and he said he needed someone who could handle operations and staff management and guest relations and all the thousand details that separated good restaurants from great ones. The salary he offered was $85,000, which was more money than I had ever imagined making, more than double what I currently earned, and he added that there would be profit sharing after the first year and a 2% equity stake that would vest over 4 years, and I felt something crack open in my chest, something that had been held tight and protected for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to let it expand. He asked if I was interested, and I managed to say yes, my voice coming out steady, even though my hands were shaking. And he smiled and said he would have his lawyer draw up a contract and we could meet next week to go over the details and make it official. After he left, I sat alone in that small office with the reservation book still open in front of me, and I let myself cry. quiet tears that I wiped away quickly in case anyone came in, tears of relief and validation, and a kind of grief for all the years I had spent believing that maybe my family was right, that maybe I was just a waitress with ideas above her station, that maybe my dreams were presumptuous, and my ambition was embarrassing. I called no one, told no one, kept the news locked inside me like a secret treasure that I needed to protect from the people who had spent years teaching me that my achievements were never quite enough to warrant their pride. When I went home that night, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my leather notebook and wrote the date and the words General Manager. And then I let myself imagine a future where I didn't have to hide who I was becoming, where my competence was recognized and valued, where I was building something that was entirely mine and earned through my own work. And I decided in that moment that I would accept the position and I would sign the contract and I would keep it secret from my family until I was ready to show them exactly who I had become while they weren't paying attention. I signed the contract with Chef Marcus on a Friday morning in his lawyer's office downtown, my hands steady as I wrote my name on each page, and I kept the signed copy in a folder in my apartment where I would take it out sometimes and look at it to remind myself that it was real, that I had achieved something significant entirely on my own. And for 2 weeks I carried this secret like a warm stone in my pocket, something solid and mine that no one could diminish or dismiss. The Sunday dinner that changed everything happened exactly 16 days after I signed that contract, and I walked into my parents' house that evening with no expectation that this would be different from any other obligation-driven family meal, no sense that I was about to reach a breaking point that I didn't even know I was approaching. Jessica was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with my mother, and I could see immediately that something was happening because my mother had that bright, determined expression she got when she was about to announce something she expected everyone to celebrate. And my father was opening a bottle of wine that was nicer than what we usually had at family dinners. "Oh, good, Maya, you're here," my mother said when I came in, and there was something in her tone that made me cautious. A kind of false cheerfulness that I had learned over the years meant I was about to be cast in some role I hadn't auditioned for. We sat down to dinner, and my father poured the wine, and my mother kept glancing at Jessica with an encouraging smile. And finally, halfway through the main course, my father cleared his throat and said, "We have some exciting news about Jessica's boutique." I set down my fork and waited, and my mother reached over to squeeze Jessica's hand and said, "We've decided to make another investment in the business, $30,000, because we believe in Jessica's vision, and we know that sometimes success takes longer than we initially expect." Jessica looked tired and unhappy, rather than excited, but she managed a small smile and said, "I'm really grateful. I know it's a lot, and my father said something about family supporting family and how they were proud to help their daughter achieve her dreams." I felt something familiar settle over me, that old recognition that I was witnessing the kind of support I had never received, but I stayed quiet and took a sip of wine and thought about the contract in my apartment and reminded myself that I had built something without their help, that their money came with strings that I was fortunate to have avoided. Then my mother turned to me with that same bright smile and said, "And we were thinking that you could help out too, Maya, since you understand the service industry from your work at the restaurant. You could work at the boutique a few days a week and help Jessica with customers and maybe bring some of that hospitality experience to the retail environment." I stared at her, not quite processing what she was suggesting, and my father added, "It would be volunteer, of course, just family helping family, maybe 10 or 15 hours a week, and it would be good for you to learn about business ownership from Jessica." The words hung in the air, and I felt something shift inside me. Some foundation that had been cracking for years finally giving way, and I said slowly, "You want me to work for free at Jessica's store?" My mother waved her hand dismissively and said, "It's not working for free, it's helping your sister. It's what families do, and honestly, Maya, it's not like you have some demanding career, you're a waitress. Your schedule is flexible, and you owe it to this family to contribute something since we've never asked you for anything before." She said it so casually, that word "just," as if my entire professional life could be summarized and dismissed in 3 words, and I felt something ignite in my chest that had been waiting for years to catch fire. I looked at my father, and he was nodding along with my mother's words, and I looked at Jessica, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. And I understood in that moment that this was the final insult, the ultimate expression of how little they valued everything I had built. And I made a decision that I had perhaps been moving toward for months or even years without fully realizing it. I smiled, a small, calm smile that probably looked like acquiescence, and I said, I need to think about it, but actually, I'd like to invite all of you to dinner next Saturday. My treat, at Marchand's. There's something I want to share with the family. And my mother looked pleased and said something about how nice it would be to have a proper meal at that beautiful restaurant. And I finished my dinner and drove home and began planning exactly how I would show them who I really was. I spent the week between that disastrous Sunday dinner and the gathering I had planned documenting everything with the kind of methodical precision I had learned from managing reservation systems and tracking inventory orders, creating a record that was both a catalog of mistreatment and a testament to my own achievement that I could hold up to the light and say, this is what happened. This is what I survived. This is what I built, despite everything. I started with the emails, going back through 5 years of correspondence to find the message I had sent to my father in March 3 years ago, asking about financial help for culinary school. The tuition at the Portland Culinary Institute was $5,200, and I had saved $2,300 of it, and I just needed help with the remainder. And I found his response that I had read so many times I almost had it memorized, the words about how they couldn't support expensive hobbies, when I hadn't proven I was serious about a real career. And then I found the email chain from 2 months later, where my mother had forwarded me pictures of Jessica's new boutique with the subject line, "So proud of our entrepreneur." And I took screenshots of both exchanges and put them in a folder on my laptop, labeled simply documentation. I went through my bank statements and calculated that in the 3 years since Jessica had received her initial funding, I had saved $15,347 while working as a server and taking every extra shift I could get, and living in a studio apartment that cost $1,200 a month, which was cheap for Portland but still took half my income. And I created a simple spreadsheet showing my savings accumulation versus what I knew had been given to Jessica, the 78,000 initially, then 20,000 more 18 months ago when the boutique first started struggling, then another 30,000 that had just been announced, which totaled $128,000 invested in a business that I knew from the fragments of conversation I had overheard was losing money steadily and had no path to profitability. I printed out my hospitality management certification from Cornell's online program, the one I had completed at night after double shifts, and I printed out my food safety manager certification and my certificate from the wine education program I had taken on my own dime, and I put these in a folder along with a copy of the signed contract with Chef Marcus that showed my title as general manager and my salary of $85,000 plus the equity stake and profit sharing. And I held this folder in my hands and felt the weight of it, the physical proof that I had become someone of substance and capability while my family had been looking in the other direction. I called each family member personally to invite them to dinner, my parents and Jessica, of course, but also my grandmother on my mother's side, and my Uncle Tom and Aunt Linda, and my father's brother David, making it a family gathering large enough to feel significant. And when each of them asked what the occasion was, I kept my voice light and said I just wanted to treat everyone to a nice meal. And I could hear in their responses that they assumed this was me finally playing the role they had always imagined for me, the grateful younger daughter who knew her place and was perhaps apologizing through generosity for not being more helpful to Jessica. I made the reservation for 8 people in the private dining room at Marchand's for 7 o'clock on Saturday, and I confirmed it 3 times that week with Marcus, who knew exactly what I was planning, and who had squeezed my shoulder and said, "They're going to be so proud of you," with such genuine warmth that I had to blink back tears, because I knew that pride was not actually what I was going to see, but I appreciated his assumption that families celebrated their children's achievements. The night before the dinner, I laid out my clothes, the black dress and blazer I wore for meetings with vendors and industry events, professional and polished, and I went over in my mind exactly what I would say and how I would say it, and I felt something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration, the knowledge that I was about to change everything and that there would be no going back to the old dynamic where I stayed small and quiet and accepted their dismissal as something I deserved. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crystal clear autumn sky that made Portland look like a postcard. And I drove to Marchand's 2 hours early so I could be there to check every detail and walk through the private dining room one more time and breathe slowly in the quiet before my family arrived and everything changed. I had dressed with care that morning. The black sheath dress and tailored blazer that I wore for vendor meetings and industry events, professional and polished in a way that should have signaled something to anyone paying attention, and I had pulled my hair back in the low chignon I wore for work, simple pearl earrings, minimal makeup, the uniform of competence that I had learned made people take me seriously in professional settings. Marcus found me in the private dining room at 5:30, arranging and rearranging the place cards even though I had already checked them twice, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Maya, breathe, you've got this, and you deserve every bit of what's about to happen." And I nodded and tried to smile and felt my stomach churning with an anxiety that was different from anything I had experienced before, because this was not about whether I could do my job, but about whether I could face my family with the truth of who I had become. The first to arrive were my Aunt Linda and Uncle Tom at 6:45, early as always, and I greeted them in the main dining room and walked them back to the private room. And my aunt said, "Oh, Maya, this is so lovely. How sweet of you to arrange this. You must have called in all your favors to get us such a nice table." And there was kindness in her voice, but also that familiar assumption that I was operating from a position of limited power, using what little influence a server might have to secure something special for her family. My parents arrived at 6:50 with Jessica, and my mother was wearing the cream-colored suit she saved for special occasions, and my father had on a tie, and Jessica looked tired and unhappy in a way that I had noticed more and more lately. And my mother kissed my cheek and said, "Darling, this is so generous of you. We really appreciate you treating us, and it's good to see you being part of the family after everything." And that phrase, "after everything," hung in the air loaded with implication, as if I had been absent or difficult rather than simply trying to survive their dismissal. My grandmother arrived last at 7 exactly. My mother's mother, who I had always suspected saw more than she said, and she squeezed my hand when I greeted her and looked at me with sharp eyes that seemed to take in my professional attire and polished appearance, and she said quietly, "You look like someone important, Maya." And I had to swallow hard because it was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged that I might be more than they assumed. We settled around the table in the private dining room with its warm lighting and view of the kitchen through a glass partition, and I had chosen this room deliberately because I wanted them to see the operation I was part of, the precision and choreography of a well-run kitchen, and my father said something about this being quite fancy for a family dinner, and my mother patted my hand and said, "Well, Maya works here, so I'm sure she gets some kind of discount, don't you, dear?" And I smiled and said nothing, and watched them study their menus while making comments about the prices that carried the implication that I was being irresponsible spending money on them that I surely couldn't afford. My Uncle David asked me how things were going at work with that tone people use when they're being polite about a job they consider beneath real discussion, and Jessica wouldn't quite meet my eyes, and my grandmother watched me steadily from across the table, and I felt the folder with all my documentation in my bag beside my chair like a physical weight, and I thought about the contract and the certification and the spreadsheet showing $128,000 that had been invested in failure while my success had been achieved with nothing. And I took a slow breath and waited for Marcus to arrive because I knew that once he walked through that door, there would be no going back to the small, quiet version of myself that these people expected me to remain. Marcus arrived at 7:15, entering the private dining room with the easy confidence of someone who commanded respect in every space he occupied. Tall and distinguished in his chef's whites, with his name embroidered on the breast pocket, and he carried with him that aura of professional authority that came from 30 years building restaurants and training young talent and earning a James Beard nomination 3 years running. He smiled warmly at the table and said, "Good evening, everyone. I'm Marcus Chen, executive chef and owner here at Marchand's, and I wanted to come personally to welcome Maya's family and to tell you how excited we are about the next chapter for both this restaurant and for our new general manager." And I watched the words land on my family like stones dropped into still water, the ripples of confusion spreading across their faces as they tried to make sense of what they had just heard. My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and she looked from Marcus to me with an expression that was equal parts bewilderment and that automatic dismissiveness that had become her default response to anything connected to my work. And she said, "General Manager, that's wonderful. Maya works so hard here," with that bright, meaningless tone people use when they're acknowledging something they don't actually understand or care about. And I could see her already preparing to redirect the conversation to something she considered more important. My father extended his hand to Marcus with that hearty businessman's greeting he used with other men in professional settings, people he considered peers, and he said, "That's quite a promotion for our Maya. We appreciate you recognizing her dedication. She's always been such a hard worker." And there was pride in his voice, but it was the shallow pride of someone complimenting a child for good behavior, not the deep recognition of actual achievement. And I felt something tighten in my chest, because even now, even with Marcus standing there in his chef's whites addressing me as general manager, my father couldn't quite grasp that this was real and significant and mine. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something that might have been confusion, or might have been the first flickering awareness that the sister she had dismissed was perhaps not who she thought, and my grandmother had gone very still in that way she had when she was paying close attention, her eyes moving between Marcus and me with an intensity that suggested she understood more than the others about what was actually happening. I met Marcus's eyes and gave him the smallest nod, the signal we had agreed upon, and I said with a calmness that surprised me given how my heart was hammering against my ribs, "Thank you, Marcus. I should clarify for my family, since I don't think they quite understand yet. I'm not being promoted here at Marchand's. I'm starting officially next Monday as the general manager of your new restaurant, Wildflower, the opening we've been planning for the last 4 months." And I watched the words register slowly, the confusion deepening rather than clearing. And my mother said, "New restaurant, how lovely. So you'll be managing some of the staff there." Still trying to fit this information into the framework of me as someone small and peripheral. And I smiled and shook my head and said, "I'll be managing all of the staff, 42 people total, overseeing operations, working with Marcus on everything from menu planning to vendor relationships to hiring, and my official start date is Monday, but I've been working on the project since July when Marcus offered me the position." And the silence that followed was thick and strange, broken only by my Uncle Tom saying, "Well, that sounds like quite a responsibility, Maya," with genuine surprise in his voice. And I thought about the folder in my bag, and the contract inside it, and the fact that I hadn't even told them yet about the salary, or the equity, or the fact that I had beaten out candidates from Cornell and the Culinary Institute of America. And I realized that this was just the beginning, that the real revelation was still to come, and I felt simultaneously terrified and more certain than I had ever been that I was doing exactly what needed to be done. Marcus reached into the leather portfolio he had brought with him and pulled out a document that I recognized as the contract I had signed 4 months ago. The papers I had read and reread in private with tears streaming down my face because someone finally believed in me enough to put their faith in writing. And he laid it on the table in front of my parents and said, "I want to make sure Maya's family understands exactly what we're talking about here, because when I say general manager, I mean full operational authority over a $2 million restaurant project, and Maya's compensation package reflects that responsibility. And he pointed to the salary line on the contract where the number $85,000 was printed in clear black ink, and he continued, plus 5% equity in Wildflower, and profit sharing that we project will add another 15 to 20,000 annually once we're established. And the silence that descended over the table was different from before, heavier and more complete, the kind of silence that comes when people's fundamental understanding of reality has just been challenged. My mother's face had gone pale and she was staring at the contract as if it were written in a language she couldn't quite comprehend. And my father had leaned forward to read the numbers, and I watched the color rise in his cheeks. That red flush that happened when he was angry or embarrassed or confronted with something that contradicted his view of how things should be. And Jessica had started crying quietly, tears running down her face that she wasn't bothering to wipe away, and my Aunt Linda said, $85,000, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, and I nodded and said, yes, which is more than I ever asked you for, more than I ever needed to start. I just wanted $5,000 3 years ago to take some culinary courses and maybe get a certification. And I was told that I needed to be realistic about my prospects. And I heard the tremor in my own voice, but pushed through it, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, the moment when I finally made them see what they had refused to acknowledge. Marcus, bless him, continued, as if he were simply providing professional context, saying, I should mention that Maya was competing against 8 other candidates for this position, including graduates from Cornell's hospitality program, someone with an MBA from NYU, and a woman who had been assistant GM at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Seattle, and Maya beat all of them because she has an instinct for this work that you can't teach. She understands people and operations and how to make a dining experience memorable. And I've been in this business for 30 years, and I know talent when I see it. And I watched my father's hands curl into fists on the table, and my mother press her fingers to her lips. And my Uncle Tom said, Maya, why didn't you tell us about this? And I felt something hard and tight in my chest as I replied, because every time I tried to talk about my work or my goals or what I was learning, I was told I was just a waitress, that I needed to face reality, that maybe I should help Jessica with her real business instead of playing around with my little restaurant dreams. And I reached into my bag and pulled out my own folder, the one I had prepared with printouts of my hospitality management certification from the online program I had completed last year. The letter of recommendation from Marcus that detailed my 4 years of progressive responsibility at Marchand's, the article from Portland Monthly that had mentioned me by name as someone to watch in the local restaurant scene, and I spread them on the table next to the contract and said, this is what I've been doing while you assumed I was going nowhere. This is what I built with nothing, while Jessica got $128,000. And that number hung in the air like an accusation, which I suppose it was. And my grandmother reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said quietly, Maya, we should have seen this. I should have seen this. And Jessica's quiet crying became sobs, her shoulders shaking, and my mother finally found her voice and said, Maya, we never meant to make you feel. We thought Jessica needed more support. We thought you were fine. And I looked at her and said with a calmness that came from finally speaking truth. I had held silent for years. I was never fine. I was surviving despite you, not because of you, and the fact that you couldn't see that you never once asked what I needed or celebrated what I accomplished, that's what I need you to understand tonight. I reached into my folder and pulled out the spreadsheet I had created 3 weeks ago, the one where I had documented every dollar my parents had given to Jessica over the past 3 years, every check and wire transfer and rent payment and emergency cash infusion that I had witnessed or overheard or been told about in passing, as if it were perfectly normal and reasonable. And I unfolded the paper and smoothed it on the table next to Marcus's contract and said, I want to talk about money now. I want to talk about the actual numbers because I think we need to be honest about what's happened in this family. And my mother's face went from pale to flushed, and she said, Maya, this isn't appropriate. We don't discuss private family financial matters in front of everyone. and I felt something surge in me, something that was part anger and part liberation, and I said, "You've discussed my failures and my inadequacies in front of everyone at every holiday dinner for 3 years, so I think we can discuss this." And I pointed to the first entry on my spreadsheet and continued. March 2020, $78,000 to start Jessica's boutique. June 2020, $12,000 for initial inventory. September 2020, $8,000 when the first quarter didn't meet projections. February 2021, $20,000 for expansion into online sales. August 2021, another $10,000 for marketing. And I watched Jessica crying harder now and my father standing up as if he might leave or might shout or might do something to stop this litany of numbers. And I kept going because I needed them to hear it all laid out clearly without euphemism or justification. March 2022, $15,000 for rent assistance. October 2022, $23,000 described as a loan, but we all know it was never going to be repaid. And then 3 weeks ago, $30,000 more, which brings the total to $196,000. And I heard my Aunt Linda gasp and my Uncle Tom say Jesus Christ under his breath. And I looked at my mother and said, "And when I asked for $5,000 3 years ago to take some culinary courses, you told me I needed to be realistic about my earning potential. You told me that restaurant work wasn't a real career. You told me that maybe I should think about something more stable like Jessica's boutique." And my voice cracked on those last words. But I pushed through because I was so close to finally saying everything that had lived in my chest like a stone for years. And I pointed to my certification and my letter of recommendation and the contract with Marcus's signature and said, "I built this with nothing. I worked double shifts and took online classes at midnight and saved every dollar I could and networked on my days off and proved myself to people who didn't share my last name, and I did it while listening to you tell me I was pathetic and going nowhere and wasting my life. And I need you to understand that I'm not asking you for money now. I'm not asking you to invest in Wildflower or to give me anything at all. I'm asking you to acknowledge that you made a choice to believe in Jessica and not in me. And that choice wasn't based on our actual abilities or potential. It was based on something else, something I still don't fully understand, but that hurt me every single day." And my grandmother squeezed my hand tighter and said, "Maya's right, Richard. Susan, she's absolutely right, and you need to hear this." And my mother was shaking her head and saying, "We gave Jessica money because she asked for it, because she had a business plan. You never asked, Maya. You never told us you wanted help." And I felt something break open in me at those words, at the audacity of that defense, and I said very quietly, "I did ask. I asked 3 years ago, and you said no, and after that I learned not to ask because asking meant hearing again that I wasn't worth investing in, that my dreams were less valid than Jessica's, that I was just a waitress who needed to face reality. So I stopped asking, and I stopped hoping you would notice what I was doing, and I built something anyway. And now I need to know if you can actually see me as I am, instead of as the daughter who disappointed you by not being Jessica." Jessica's crying had become something beyond tears now, a kind of gasping sob that shook her whole body, and she pushed back from the table and stood up and said through the tears, "The boutique is bankrupt. It's over. I'm losing $8,000 every single month and have been for the last year and a half." And my mother reached for her and said, "Jessica, sweetheart, we don't need to talk about this now." But Jessica shook her head violently and said, "No, Maya's right. She's right about everything, and I can't keep pretending anymore." And she looked at me with eyes that were red and streaming and said, "The total isn't 196,000, Maya. It's more. It's so much more because they've been covering my losses every month for 18 months. That's another 144,000 at least. Probably more because there were some months when it was 10 or 12,000. And I knew it was failing. I knew it 6 months after I opened, but I couldn't admit it because I was supposed to be the successful one, the one with the real business, the daughter they could be proud of." And I felt something shift in my chest. Something that wasn't quite sympathy but wasn't satisfaction either. Just a kind of sad recognition of how thoroughly our parents had damaged both of us in different ways. And Jessica continued, I hated you sometimes, Maya. I hated you because you were actually good at what you did, and you didn't need them, and I needed them for everything. Every month I had to go to Dad and tell him the numbers, and watch him write another check, and know that I was failing, and he was watching me fail, but we all just kept pretending it was going to turn around. And my father had his head in his hands now, and my mother was saying, "Jessica, stop. Please stop." But Jessica kept going as if something had broken loose in her, and all the truth she had been holding back was flooding out. "I knew you were better than me. I knew it when we were in high school, and you were working at that little cafe, and the manager told Mom you were the best employee they'd ever had, and Mom just smiled and changed the subject. I knew it when you were at Marchand's, and you came home talking about systems and operations, and your eyes would light up and Mom would say, 'That's nice, dear,' and then ask me about the boutique. I knew you were going to make something of yourself without any help, and I was drowning in their money and their expectations and their need for me to succeed because they'd invested so much." And she looked at our parents and said, "You did this to both of us. You made her feel worthless, and you made me feel like I had to succeed with your money, or I was nothing. And now she's got this incredible opportunity that she earned completely on her own, and I've got a failed business and $340,000 of your money gone, just gone, all of it lost." And the number hit the table like a bomb, and my Aunt Linda said, $340,000, in a voice that was barely audible, and my Uncle Tom was staring at my father with an expression I couldn't quite read, and my grandmother said, "Richard, Susan, what have you done?" And I looked at Jessica and saw not my competitor or my tormentor, but another casualty of our parents' inability to see their children clearly, to let us be who we actually were instead of who they needed us to be. And I said quietly, "Jess, I'm sorry. I'm sorry they did this to you too." And she shook her head and said, "Don't apologize to me. You have nothing to apologize for. You were right about everything. And I've been complicit in making you feel small because it made me feel bigger. And I'm sorry, Maya. I'm so sorry for every time I let them put you down, or stayed silent when they dismissed you, or acted like my failing business was more impressive than your actual success." And in that moment, I saw my sister clearly for perhaps the first time. Saw her not as the golden child who had everything, but as someone who had been given everything except the freedom to fail, the space to find her own path, the chance to build something real. I looked at my parents across the table, at their faces that showed shock and something like fear, and I felt the words I had been rehearsing in my head for 3 weeks rise up in my throat. And I said, "I need to tell you what this has been like, living as your daughter for 28 years. And I need you to listen without interrupting or justifying or explaining, because I've listened to your explanations my whole life, and now it's my turn." And my mother opened her mouth as if to protest, but my grandmother said firmly, "Susan, let her speak." And I continued, "I have spent years believing that I wasn't good enough, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me less valuable than Jessica, less worthy of investment and support and pride. And I internalized that message so completely that even when Marcus offered me this position, I almost didn't believe I deserved it. I almost turned it down because I had learned from you that I was just a waitress, that my work didn't matter, that my dreams were unrealistic and my ambitions were foolish. And I felt my voice strengthening as I spoke, felt something settling into place inside me that had been dislocated for years. And I said, "I forgive you. I want you to know that first. I forgive you because I think you genuinely didn't see what you were doing. I think you convinced yourselves that you were helping Jessica and that I was fine, that I didn't need help because I was already working and paying my bills. But forgiveness doesn't mean I'm willing to continue this pattern. It doesn't mean I'm going to pretend this didn't happen or accept your treatment of me as normal." And my father finally spoke, his voice rough and uncertain, and he said, "Maya, we never meant to make you feel worthless. We love you." And I nodded and said, "I believe you love me, Dad. But love without respect isn't enough. Love without seeing who I actually am isn't enough. And going forward, I need both, or I need distance." And I let those words sit in the silence for a moment before continuing. I won't be lending money to Jessica or to you. I won't be working for free at the boutique or anywhere else. I won't be attending family dinners where my accomplishments are dismissed or where I'm expected to celebrate Jessica while my own achievements are ignored. And I won't be available for phone calls where you need something from me without offering anything in return. And my mother was crying now, and she said, "You're punishing us. You're cutting us off." And I shook my head and said, "I'm not punishing you. I'm establishing boundaries. I'm telling you what I need in order to have a relationship with you. And you get to decide if you can meet those needs, or if you'd rather hold on to your version of who I am, instead of accepting who I actually am." And my grandfather cleared his throat and spoke for the first time that evening, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone turn to look at him, and he said, "Richard, Susan, I've stayed quiet for too long about this, and I won't stay quiet anymore. I've watched you dismiss Maya for years, and I've told myself it wasn't my place to interfere, but Judith and I have always known that Maya was exceptional. We've watched her work ethic and her dedication and her kindness to people who couldn't do anything for her, and we've been ashamed of our silence." And my grandmother added, "We see you, Maya. We've always seen you, and we're proud of you, and we should have said so loudly and often instead of keeping quiet to preserve family peace." And I felt tears finally coming then. Not tears of anger or vindication, but tears of recognition, of being truly seen by people who mattered to me. And I looked at my parents and said, "This is your choice now. You can be part of my life as I actually am, or you can hold on to your fantasy of who you wanted me to be, but you can't have both, and I won't wait forever for you to decide." 2 months later, I stood in the kitchen of Marchand's new location, Marcus's vision finally realized in this beautiful space with exposed brick and copper fixtures and an open kitchen design that let diners watch the controlled chaos of dinner service. And I was reviewing the reservation system on my tablet when I heard my name and looked up to see the hostess leading my parents to a table in the main dining room, and my stomach tightened instinctively before I reminded myself that I had chosen this, that I had left the door open for them to walk through if they were willing to see me clearly. They had called 3 times in the 2 months since that dinner. Awkward conversations where my mother tried to explain and my father mostly stayed silent. And I had listened without anger, but also without accommodation, holding to the boundaries I had set even when my mother's voice broke, and she said she missed me, because I knew that missing me wasn't the same as seeing me, and I needed both. The first time they asked to come to the restaurant, I had said no, told them I needed more time, but when they called last week, my father had said something different, had said, "Maya, we'd like to see what you've built. We'd like to watch you work if you'll let us." And the phrasing of it, the acknowledgement that this was something I had built, something worth watching, had made me say yes. I watched them now from the kitchen doorway, saw my mother looking around at the space with an expression I couldn't quite read, and Marcus came up beside me and said, "Your parents?" And I nodded and he said, "Want me to comp their meal?" And I shook my head and said, "No, they can pay like everyone else. That's not being cruel. That's just being clear about what this is." And he smiled and squeezed my shoulder and went back to expediting. The evening proceeded with the rhythm I had worked so hard to establish, servers moving efficiently through their sections, kitchen calling out orders with precision, the whole operation humming with the kind of coordinated effort that only came from good training and clear systems. And twice I had to intervene, once when a new server froze up during a rush, and once when a table had a legitimate complaint about timing, and both times I was aware of my parents watching, seeing me manage staff and handle problems and move through the space with authority. When the dinner rush finally slowed, I went to their table, stood beside it in my professional clothes with my tablet in hand, and my mother looked up at me with tears in her eyes and said, "Maya, this is extraordinary. You're extraordinary." And I felt something loosen in my chest, but I didn't let it dissolve all my caution, didn't let one good moment erase 2 months of careful boundary keeping, and I said thank you. And my father added, "We've been reading the reviews. There have been 3 articles that specifically mentioned your management, and we showed them to everyone. We've been telling people our daughter is the general manager here, and I saw that he needed me to acknowledge this, needed me to recognize their effort at Pride. And I said, I appreciate that, I really do. But I need you to understand that this can't be performative. I can't have you proud of me in public, but dismissive in private. I need consistency, or I need distance. And my mother nodded quickly and said, We understand. We're trying, Maya. We're really trying. We've been in therapy, both of us, talking about how we parented you and Jessica, and where we went wrong. And this surprised me enough that I pulled out the third chair at their table and sat down, and I said, Tell me about that. My father looked uncomfortable, but he met my eyes and said, The therapist asked us why we invested so much in Jessica's business, and we said it was because she had a plan. And the therapist asked if you had ever asked for anything, and we realized you had. You'd asked for culinary school money, and we'd said no. And when she asked us why we said no, we didn't have a good answer, except that you seemed fine. You seemed like you were handling everything, and she pointed out that we had punished you for being capable and rewarded Jessica for being needy. And hearing him say it, hearing him articulate what I had felt for years, but never quite named, created a space for something new between us. Not forgiveness because I had already offered that, but maybe the beginning of actual understanding. I told them about Jessica, that she had closed the boutique and gotten a job as an assistant manager at a different retail store, that we had gotten coffee twice and were slowly building something honest. And my mother said, She told us about the coffee. She said you were kind to her even though she didn't deserve it. And I said, She deserves kindness. What she doesn't deserve is to be set up for failure with money she couldn't afford to lose and expectations she couldn't meet. And my father flinched, but nodded. We talked for 20 minutes, the longest real conversation we had had in years. And when they got up to leave, my mother hugged me and whispered, I see you now, Maya. I promise I see you. And I let myself believe that maybe she was starting to. The next Tuesday, I was training a new server named Jennifer, who was 19 and working her way through community college, and I watched her struggle with the reservation system and then figure it out, watched her face light up when she got it right. And I remembered being 19 and discovering I was good at this work, good at the coordination and the systems and the human element of hospitality. And I pulled her aside after service and said, You're doing really well, you have good instincts for this. And she looked surprised and said, Really? I feel like I'm always messing something up. And I said, Everyone messes things up at first, that's how you learn. But you're quick and you pay attention and you're kind to the back-of-house staff, which matters more than you know. And if you ever want to learn more about restaurant management, I'm happy to teach you. And her whole face transformed and she said, You do that? You'd teach me? And I said, Yes, because someone should have done it for me and didn't, and I'm not going to perpetuate that. And I meant it. Meant that I would pay forward the opportunities I had been denied, would see potential in people who were overlooked the way I had been overlooked. That night I went home to my new apartment, not a studio anymore, but a real one-bedroom in a good neighborhood with a kitchen that actually had counter space and windows that let in morning light. And I sat on my couch with a cup of tea and thought about the journey from that family dinner 2 months ago to this moment. Thought about Jessica's confession and my grandparents' support and my parents' awkward attempts at reconciliation. And I realized that the vindication I had imagined, the moment of triumph I had rehearsed in my head for weeks, had been satisfying but ultimately less important than what came after. The slow work of rebuilding relationships on honest foundations and the daily practice of believing in my own worth, regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged it. I had spent so many years waiting for my parents to see me, believing that their recognition would somehow complete me or heal the wound their dismissal had created. But sitting in my own apartment that I had earned with my own work, thinking about the restaurant where my name was on reviews and my decisions shaped operations, I understood that I had already been whole, that their failure to see me had been painful, but not definitive, that I had built a life of meaning and competence and quiet pride, even while they looked away. The recognition, when it finally came, was sweet, but not transformative, because the transformation had already happened. had been happening slowly over years of double shifts and online courses and small acts of excellence that no one was watching. And I had become someone who didn't need validation from people who had withheld it. Someone who could offer herself the belief and support she had always deserved. And that self-recognition, that internal certainty of worth, was a kind of freedom that no family dinner or professional triumph could give me, because it came from within, from the accumulated evidence of my own capability and character, and I knew now that it could never be taken away.